Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're diving deep into PHP and databases, specifically PDO. If you've ever wanted to build dynamic web apps, especially ones that use MySQL, PDO is going to be a game changer. We'll unpack what PDO is, why it's essential for developers working with databases. We'll even look at some practical tips, installation, usage, all that good stuff. We'll make sure you have those aha moments along the way. First things first, though, what even is PDO?
So PDO stands for Portable Data Object. It's basically this really powerful interface in PHP that lets you connect to and interact with a bunch of different databases. You don't have to learn a whole new language for each one.
So it's like having a universal translator for databases. Instead of needing a phrase book for MySQL and then another one for like PostgreSQL and every other system out there.
Exactly. That's a really great way to put it. You can use PDO's consistent set of methods and functions. It doesn't matter what database you're working with. You don't need to get bogged down in all of the specific syntax and quirks of each one.
That's got to be super useful, especially for web developers, right? They're often working with different databases. I bet it makes your code way cleaner and easier to manage.
Oh, absolutely. It really does.
Yeah.
Imagine like you build this awesome web app, you're using MySQL, then a new client comes along, loves the app, but they use PostgreSQL.
Oh, that's got to be a nightmare.
Right. Without PDO, you'd have to rewrite huge chunks of your code to make it work with the new database system. But with PDO, you can often just change a few things in your connection string. That's the part of the code that tells PDO which database to connect to, and boom, you're good to go.
Wow. So it's like having the magical adapter, right? The one that lets you plug in your electronics anywhere in the world. No voltage differences to worry about or anything. Okay, so PDO sounds like something every developer who works with databases needs. How do we get this magic up and running? Is it something that comes standard with PHP or is it a separate installation?
Good news is it often comes included with PHP.
Yeah.
Nice little bonus. But there are a couple of things to remember, especially when you're enabling the correct PDO driver for your specific database.
Right, the drivers, like making sure you've got the right adapter before you try plugging in your laptop in another country. You don't want to fry anything.
Exactly.
Oh,
Every database needs a specific PDO driver. It acts like an adapter, so PDO can communicate with that database the right way. If you're using MySQL, you'll need the PDO MySQL driver enabled.
makes sense. How do we check if we have the right drivers, though? Is there like an easy way to do that?
Yeah, there is. PHP has this built-in function. It's called PDO.getAvailableDrivers.
Yeah.
It gives you an array of all the drivers you've got installed and ready to go.
Convenient. I wish it was that easy to check if I'd packed the right adapters when I travel.
Right. And it gets even better. You can use some PHP code to double-check for specific drivers, like PDO MySQL, just to be extra
Okay.
sure. Yeah, you could use something like this. PHP, available drivers. Get available drivers. AEEOPE MySQL drivers installed. Echo, PDO MySQL driver is not installed. You'll need to enable it. This little code snippet first gets all the available drivers, uses that PDO.getAvailableDrivers function we just talked about. Then it checks if MySQL is in that array of drivers. If it is, you're good. If not, you'll need to enable it. You can usually do that in your PHP configuration file, which is normally called php.ini.
So it's like double checking your adapter situation before you even leave for your trip. Speaking of things that can go wrong, let's talk about troubleshooting. Even with the best tools, sometimes things just don't work right, especially in tech.
It's very true. PDO is designed to make our lives easier, but there's some issues that can come up, especially during installation. One of the most common ones, especially for Linux users, are permission issues.
Oh yeah, permission issues. Those can be tricky. Can you give us a quick rundown on what those are and why they even matter when we're talking about PDO and databases?
Sure. Basically, file permissions in Linux, well, in any operating system really, they're like rules for who can access and interact with specific files and folders.
So it's like PDO needs the right key to unlock the database door. Without the right permissions, it's locked out.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. PDO needs certain permissions to read from and write to database files. If it doesn't have those permissions, you're going to run into errors.
That's a great analogy. So what does this mean practically for someone setting up PDO? Let's say they're on a Linux system. What do they need to do to make sure they have the right permissions?
In a lot of cases, you might have to use command line tools, something like chmod, to adjust the permissions on your database files and folders. That lets your PHP scripts, which you use to interact with the database through PDO, have read and write access.
Like giving your PHP script the right security clearance, right? So we've covered a lot here in this first act. We've defined PDO, talked about its advantages, how to install it, even how to troubleshoot those permission issues. But I'm really eager to dive into actually using PDO, interacting with the databases. That's where the real magic happens. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back to unlock even more PDO power. And we're back. Ready to actually use PDO to work with our databases? Feels like we've laid a good foundation. Now it's time to actually build something.
I like that. Now that we've got PDO installed, drivers are all set, next up is actually establishing a connection to our database.
Okay, so it's like we've got our phone line all set up, but we haven't dialed the number yet. How do we actually make that connection?
We need to create what's called a PDO object. This object, it acts as our direct line to the database. It's how we're going to send our requests, get information back, all of that.
So it's picking up the phone and dialing the number. What information do we need to make that call?
Just like with a phone number, we need a few key pieces of information to connect to the database. First, we need to specify what type of database we're using. So MySQL, PostgreSQL, SQLite, all the usual suspects.
Right, got to speak the right language. Then what?
After that, we need the host. That's basically the address of where our database is hanging out. If it's on the same server as our PHP, we can often just use localhost and, of course, the name of the specific database we want to get into.
Like giving the city, the street, and the house number to our GPS. I'm guessing we need some login credentials, too. We can't just waltz into any database.
You got it. We'll need our username and password. Got to authenticate ourselves, prove we have permission to access this database.
Security first. So we've got all these pieces: database type, host, database name, username, password. How do we package that all up and send it off to PDO?
This is where that connection string we mentioned earlier comes in. Basically, it's a specially formatted string. It holds all those vital connection details, but in a way that PDO understands.
Ah, like that magical adapter we were talking about. It's the plug that fits into the outlet and makes everything work.
Perfect analogy. We give this connection string to PDO when we create our PDO object, and if all is well credentials check out, the database exists we are in.
Connection established. Now, how do we actually talk to the database using PDO? What language are we speaking?
That's where SQL comes in structured query language. It's the language that databases understand. It's how we ask for data, add new data, update things, delete things. It's how we have a conversation with the database.
Okay, so I'm picturing myself talking to a database, but instead of casual chit-chat, it's all SQL commands. So how do we send those commands using PDO?
PDO provides us these really handy methods for sending our SQL queries. One of those common is the PDO.query method. We simply give our SQL query as a string to this method, and PDO does the rest.
So if I wanted to, say, select all the rows from a table called users, my SQL query would be select from users, and I'd use PDO.query, select from users, to execute it.
You got it. PDO takes that query, sends it to the database, and then handles the results. Those results can then be processed and used however you need in your application.
That's pretty straightforward. A lot less intimidating than it seems at first.
PDO really does make it much more approachable. But you did bring up a good point earlier. Sometimes things don't go as planned. What happens when we have errors? How do we handle those gracefully?
And we're back. We often focus on what to do when things go right, but in programming, probably in life too, it's super important to be ready for when things go wrong.
Absolutely. Error handling, that's one of those things that can really, set apart a good developer from a great one. And luckily, PDO gives us some really great tools for dealing with those errors.
So let's say we're happily sending our SQL queries through PDO, everything's going great, but then bam, disaster. Maybe we've got a typo in our query, or we're trying to access a table that doesn't even exist. What happens then?
Well, if you don't have good error handling in place, your app could crash. Then you've got users staring at some confusing error message, or even worse, just a blank screen. Not a good look.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
How does PDO help us avoid that whole, application meltdown scenario?
So PDO gives us a couple of different ways to handle errors. They've got their own pros and cons. One common way is to use exceptions.
Exceptions? That sounds kind of dramatic, like PDO throws a fit and says, nope, something's wrong.
Yeah, kind of. Technically, an exception is a signal, an alert, that something unexpected happened in our code. When PDO hits an error, it can be set up to throw an exception. If that exception isn't handled, boom, it stops your script right there.
Okay, so it's like PDO's hitting the pause button saying, hold on, we got to figure this out before we move on. So how do we actually handle those exceptions, prevent that whole meltdown?
That's where catching exceptions comes in. We can write specific blocks of code to catch those exceptions. So instead of crashing, we can display a nice error message, something user-friendly, or even log that error so we can debug it later.
Like having a safety net to catch us if we fall. We regain control and handle it smoothly. Are there any other error handling things PDO has up its sleeve?
There are. You can also check for errors manually after each query. PDO has methods for that, like pdo.errorcode and pdo.errorinfo. This way gives you more control over how you want to respond to different errors.
So it's a trade-off, right? The convenience of exceptions, those are automatic, versus the control of checking manually. It's great that PDO gives us options. While we're talking about all these SQL queries, error handling, it reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, prepared statements. I have a feeling they all tie together somehow.
You're totally right. Prepared statements are really important, especially when we want to write secure and efficient SQL queries, particularly when we're dealing with any data a user might be putting in. We definitely don't want any malicious code sneaking into our database.
Right, got to keep things secure. So remind us, what are prepared statements again, and how do they help keep things safe?
Think of a prepared statement like a template for your SQL query. You basically create a blueprint. It's got placeholders for the values that will actually be inserted later on.
So instead of writing a brand new SQL query for every single user input, we make a template with these placeholders. That sounds way more efficient already. What about the security part?
Okay, so the cool thing is, when we send that template to the database, instead of just directly inserting the values, which is where that malicious code could be hiding, we tell PDO, hey, those placeholders, those represent values. Treat them separately, sanitize them.
Ah, so we're adding in an extra layer of protection. It's like having a security guard checking IDs at the door before letting anyone in.
Yeah. PDO takes care of properly escaping, quoting the values, making sure they're treated like data, not executable code, which is what keeps us safe from things like SQL injection attacks.
Prepared statements, efficient, secure, pretty elegant when you think about it. PDO is like that super smart friend who always knows the perfect trick. Speaking of tricks, you mentioned something earlier, transactions. What are those all about?
Transactions, think of those as safety nets for your database operations, especially when you're doing multiple things that need to be treated as one unit. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're building an e-commerce site. Someone's making a purchase.
Okay, I'm picturing a shopping cart, that checkout button, the thrill of buying something new.
Right, so that purchase involves a few different things happening in the database.
Yeah.
You need to deduct those items from inventory, update the user's order history, process the payment. What if one of those things fails?
Uh-oh, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. We wouldn't want the customer to be charged but not get their order, or even worse, get charged twice.
Exactly. And that's where transactions come in. They let us group all those database operations together, one big unit of work.
So it's all or nothing. Either everything works perfectly, or we go back to how things were, like nothing ever happened.
Exactly. If everything in the transaction is good, we commit it. All the changes are saved to the database. But if even one thing goes wrong, we roll back. All those changes, undone, like hitting undo on a whole bunch of actions.
That's so powerful. It's like a database time machine. We can go back and fix any mistakes. How do we actually use transactions with PDO?
It's surprisingly simple. PDO has three main methods for this: pdo.beginTransaction, pdo.commit, and pdo.rollback.
So we use begin transaction to start things off, commit to make it all permanent if everything looks good, and rollback to undo everything if there's a problem.
Exactly. It's a simple pattern, but it's really powerful. Makes our databases way more reliable and stops our data from getting all messed up.
We've covered a ton today, from the basics of PDO, like what it is, how to install it, to all this cool stuff like prepared statements and transactions. I gotta say, what seemed kind of scary at first now feels totally manageable.
That's great to hear. PDO might seem a little intimidating, but it's really all about making our lives, our developer lives, easier and our applications better.
So for our listeners out there ready to give PDO a try, what's the one thing you want them to remember?
Don't be afraid to just jump in. PDO might seem small, but once you know it, you can build some really cool stuff.
Couldn't agree more. And just like anything else, practice makes perfect. Start small, try out the examples we talked about. Don't be afraid to look at the PDO documentation. The possibilities are endless. And that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this adventure into the world of PDO. I'll catch you next time.